So we're delighted to be joined now by City Ed, the man behind the genuinely incredible City Ed YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us, Ed. I'll be honest, the reason I reached out is because I find your videos fascinating. If anyone listening's not checked them out, it's all about sort of urban design, cities. You look at buildings and you make me see the city I live in or now live close to. I recently moved out of London, but I see it in a different way. So Ed, how did you get into architecture and urban design? And what caught your attention?
Thanks, James. It's great to hear that you like my videos. Yeah, I think, well, it goes back as long as I remember. I've been obsessed with like cities and architecture and all that sort of stuff. I had on the floor of my bedroom, I built kind of a city when I was about 6 years old out of like cereal boxes, and I had little toy cars that I'd pretend to drive around the city. But I properly sort of built this city. We do have a picture of it somewhere. I'll try and dig out.
It's very much the level of this podcast, I think. Your pitch just right for us.
Absolute coming on your show, yeah. But even just walking around where I'm from, Manchester, and then sometimes my parents would take me to London once a year, and it'd be like this eyes wide open moment of like, oh my God, this is where I'm destined to be. Yeah, for as long as I remember, I've been obsessed with cities. I then did urban planning at Newcastle, which is like pretty on brand, I would say. And then, yeah, just since then, just carried it on, honestly. Yeah.
Fantastic. So one of the videos you've done recently, which I thought was really fascinating, was all about the Netherlands and what we should steal from the Netherlands. Because I've been there a few times. My partner has a Dutch passport. Whenever I go there, I just think this feels like utopia. So
Yeah.
what is it? Do you think that they're doing so right? And are there any sort of low-hanging fruit you think we can steal? Obviously, we could try and rebuild the entire built environment. I always say I'd like London to be like Amsterdam, but is there any low-hanging fruit we can pinch?
Oh, well, my wife is from the Netherlands as well, so we're similar there. So yeah, I think Netherlands was one of the first countries I became kind of obsessed with, and I lived there the first opportunity I got during COVID. That's the whole other story, but the first opportunity I got to live somewhere that wasn't the UK, I chose the Netherlands. Low-hanging fruit, I would say, yeah, it's got to be cycling. I mean, because that is not just about getting more people on their bikes. It's the whole thing that transcends from that, which reduces the amount of wear and tear on the roads. It increases the capacity of the streets. It allows people to live much healthier lifestyles, and it focuses the urban planning to become a bit more dense so that it kind of facilitates cycling, if that makes sense. Everything falls into place when you have that as your foundation. But also, I think they plan their cities a lot more holistically. I think I went into the video. There are just some things that we just get wrong that we don't really need to be getting wrong. So I talked at length about bins in that video, which probably isn't selling it to anyone that hasn't watched the video. But they have this system of kind of underground bins in every neighborhood. And we do have it in some places in the UK, but it's much more of a coordinated system there. And that again just means that they have more capacity for their bins. So they just plan everything holistically, everything just falls into place. And I touched on it in that video. The reason for that is because the Netherlands is most of it is below sea level, so they kind of need to plan their neighborhoods. They need to plan everything quite meticulously because otherwise they'd end up with wet feet. Whereas in the UK, we have the benefit of mostly being above sea level, so we just sort of think, oh, we don't need to plan anything, then sod it. We'll just build housing estates in the middle of nowhere with no public transport. That'll be fine. But everything, yeah, as I said, in the Netherlands is just way more holistically planned. They even have these like tram lines going off into the outskirts, into the sort of the rural areas around Amsterdam, which look a bit pointless. You're like, why have you built this white elephant? But it's because in 5, 10, 15 years, the city will expand out along those tram lines, this transit-oriented development, which is how we used to do it in the UK, but for some reason we gave up. And that everything just falls into place then. Their society works a lot better. They're not all crowding onto the roads in their cars. They're getting around in a much healthier way, in a much more sustainable way. And with the UK, where we have kind of the NHS, I don't understand why cycling and walking hasn't been more of a focus over the last 40, 50 years, because it would save the NHS a lot of money if we were, in my opinion.
I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? Because cycling in the Netherlands, and I've worked in the Netherlands for a period of time as well, it's not just, oh, we've put some cycle lanes in and a few more people cycle. It's a fundamentally different
Yeah.
culture and way of life that we're sort of trying to bring in. One of the things I think we talk about a lot on this podcast is that in a number of different domains, for some reason, Britain is really, really bad at kind of looking at other countries and thinking about parts of their culture or infrastructure or economy that we can adopt ourselves. So we
Agree.
talked about this with nuclear. We've talked about it with high-speed rail, for example. What are some of the other areas where perhaps we're just really not looking at other countries beyond the Netherlands and
Mhm.
taking inspiration from them.
Yeah, you had that lady on the podcast again, the HS2 one. I forget her name. Sorry.
Sally Gimson.
Yeah, she was brilliant. I think she said we need to be more humble and just ask other countries for how they do it best. I'd say Japan for high density living. I haven't been to Japan, but it is, again, what I think for anyone who's interested in cities, it's probably quite high up the agenda is to go to Tokyo. But the way that they incorporate high density living, and I'm not advocating for everybody living in, those really small micro flats, but just their, again, transit oriented development in Tokyo is a really big thing that we should be focusing on. And yeah, not being afraid to push the density envelope out, especially in our largest cities and especially close to major public transport hubs. In my opinion, there's not a huge amount of reason why we couldn't build not massive skyscrapers, but 5, 6, 7 stories across sort of London's zone threes, 4 and 5, as long as it's near the tube, near the trains. That's how we're going to hope to tackle this kind of housing crisis that is looming over our society and has been for decades, will be for decades more, I'm sure. But I think that's probably one of the things that we can use as inspiration from another country. Definitely, I would look at the Spanish and the Italians on HS2 because they seem to have done it efficiently. I think, I mean, I
Hmm.
don't know much about how these things are sort of funded or how these things work, but it seems to me as though I think certainly the Spanish keep all of that expertise in-house, so they don't go asking consultants to do things, they don't ask other firms to do things that take ages and ages. They have it all in-house, which means they can have a rolling process of just building these high speed lines, almost kind of like an assembly line. And I think something like that, being more efficient with how we build public infrastructure, because I think we've all seen those graphs that sort of show that the UK, it costs way more per mile to build any sort of railway or high speed line or whatever in the UK. And I think we
Hmm.
need to tackle why that is before we continue, because we can't have another project costing 100 billion when it costs the Spanish to do, I think, like a fifth of that. So yeah.
It's funny you should mention railways because something I wanted to ask you about is one thing I love about your videos is the fact that you both appreciate history and you've got these amazing dives into sort of different architectural styles that are hidden in London. I just before this was watching your video about the Blitz and the holes
Oh
that
yeah.
created and how that was filmed. So that's brilliant. But also, you want to build things. You talk about new developments and stuff. So how do you think we should weigh the trade-offs of protecting history and choosing what to keep and what to knock down? A really good example of this, another one of your videos, I guess, is Liverpool Street, where
Yeah.
there's currently a big proposal to regenerate it, put a big skyscraper on top to pay for it, and some
Mhm.
people are very unhappy about that. So how should we think about something like that?
Yeah, well, I talk quite a bit about placemaking, and when I first came across this term, it was about 10 or 15 years ago, and I thought it was so woolly when I first heard it. And maybe there are people out there that think the same, but as I've got more into it, I've realized that it is really important. It's essentially just using every single bit of a site or considering how it could be embedded within the sort of the new development. So there was a scheme that I did a video about, Shoreditch Works, and it's essentially this huge city block just to the west of Old Street or in that kind of area. And there's loads of existing listed buildings on it. Some are small, some are large, and then there's this big courtyard in the middle, and that's where the majority of the development is. But as part of that, they're opening up a lot of these, what are currently just the rear side of the building. So there's not really much there. They're opening a lot of that up into this new public realm and really celebrating all of the heritage in there. Even if it's not particularly impressive, even if it's just a small little building, integrating those older buildings can introduce a bit of a human scale, which is quite difficult to achieve in a lot of new developments. And I think that kind of thing where we just bring these buildings in and say, actually, how can we integrate this? How can we make this into a nice little cute courtyard where you'll have a little cafe? How can we make this old church central to the new development and things like that? I think just tackling it in that kind of way rather than just being like, right, we're going to do a blank slate yet again, because we tried a lot of blank slate stuff, I think, in the post-war era, and some of it worked great. Some of it we had to do from a blank slate, like the Barbican Centre, which was there's nothing there after the Blitz, so we had to do a blank slate there. But if we have existing buildings on site, I don't see why we can't look at reusing those a little bit, maybe extending them, and just giving them a new lease of life. And that's what people really connect with, I think, when they recognize bits of the old city in the new development, rather than it just being something somewhere they don't recognize. People connect with the new development a lot more then, I think.
This is like the harbour building in Antwerp, is it? If I remember rightly as well, where they've literally sort of built a skyscraper over the old building and kind
Oh,
of kept
okay.
it
I'm not aware of that
preserved
particular
underneath.
example, but I know other examples of that kind of stuff where they've done that, and it's really good.
Highly recommend it. There's some very
Cool.
good YouTube videos on that as well. Is there like a particular regeneration project or building project that you think's been done particularly well like that?
I would say, and this isn't me saying that everywhere should look like this, but I think Hackney Wick kind of exemplifies what I was just saying quite well. It's reused. So you look at Queen's Yard, for instance, which is essentially just a car park. And that's brilliant because I think before I moved to London, I still had this like blank slate mentality of like, oh, you can't just have a car park as like the main heart of the sort of area. But in Hackney Wicket, it works. It's a car park during the week and it's a car park most weekends, but it's surrounded by all of these bars and restaurants that kind of spill into the car park and create this like almost human scale place. But when we talk about retaining heritage how it is, Hackney Wick literally has a surface car park that it's managed to turn into quite a strong place. And obviously, on top of that, you've got all of the old mills and factories that have been converted into office space. That you have a lot of those throughout UK cities. And then the new development in Hackney Wick, there's a design code, so it can't be taller than 6 stories, and it has to have like brick. It has to look a bit like the warehouses that exist in the area already. And
Mm.
what that has done is it's created a bit of harmony across the whole area. Nothing is too tall. All of the streets are nice and tree lined. There's still a lot of sunlight that gets into the streets, and all of the new development blends in really well with what was there before. So I think Hackney Wick is a good example. I really like what they've done at Elephant and Castle as well with the new park there. The park that they've created at Elephant Park used to be the courtyard or the sort of the middle area of the Haygate estate. So there was a lot of trees planted when that estate was built in the 60s, I think it was. And so they were able to keep those mature trees. And as a result, the park in the middle of Elephant Park, even though it's like, I don't know, like 2 or 3 years old, it looks like it's been there forever. And all of these trees are really huge and there's plenty of bushes and you can really get lost in the park, even though it's not very big. I think that's another really good example of keeping trees and making a place look like it's been there forever is another really successful thing that we do with our new developments. And I'm quite glad that we're moving away from just having a windswept square, paved, maybe a few benches, and it's not very inspiring, not a very nice place to sit, not a very nice place to be. I'm really glad that we're moving away from that and focusing more on the space in between buildings. I think that's really important.
I used to live near Elephant and Castle back when it was still the Haygate estate and the old shopping centre. And I went back through it a couple of months ago now. And I remember thinking, I don't know where I am. I think I even
Yeah.
had to look on Google Maps to work out what was going on. It had changed so much.
He often has these episodes. It's very difficult.
There's gales now, which is just like you think about how Elephant Castle was, yeah, just 5 years ago, and now the thought that there's a gales there is, I mean, a lot of people will say gentrification, and a lot of people have been displaced by the development, but I think purely from an urban planning, purely from an architecture perspective, I would say it's been a success.
Well, it's also bringing people in and using the place. I think one of the things I like about your earlier examples, car parks, for example, it's a normal thing in a lot of small towns across Britain that
Yeah.
car parks become used for things like farmers markets and kind of local fairs and events and things, and you sort of get them as public spaces and get activity into them as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's fascinating that there's some of those older things that we used to do or perhaps still do in more rural areas, and now we're starting to see them come back into cities again.
Agree. And I think part of that is because we've been able to increase the population of our cities. Those sorts of things become more viable when more people are living within a smaller radius, which is, I mean, I'm probably going to talk about the housing crisis. Maybe that's going to come up later anyway, but delivering more homes and delivering those homes in the right place, I believe, can be a bit of a silver bullet for a lot of the other issues that are facing this country. High street decay, if we build loads more homes in the vicinity of our high streets, inevitably you'll get more shops opening, more services to service those residents. And if you think about maybe the reason that high streets have died is because of online shopping. If you live a 5-minute walk from your local high street, why are you going to go online to get your stuff? You can get it in 5 minutes just by going to your high street. That is how we get the high street competing with online again.
I couldn't agree more. I look at the countryside and think, yeah, I quite like trees and fields. So why not have everyone live more densely in the cities with taller buildings there? Because that just seems to work better. Anyway, so is there anywhere that, you look at the city and you look at all these new developments, is there anywhere that you walk around and you think, oh, I'd just love to get my hands on this. If only I could redevelop this, because you've got a vision. You can see somewhere that could be made amazing.
Ooh, Soho. I mean, pedestrianised
Hmm.
Soho, please. Oh my God. It's just crying out for it. And every time I'm there, it's like rammed. And inevitably there's a car behind me trying to get through all the crowds. And number one, I'm like, why are you driving here? This is just like the worst place to drive, surely. I know that there's obviously quite a lot of local residents and the council is a bit tetchy about pedestrianising Soho. Personally, I would prefer them to pedestrianise Soho over Oxford Street and the bits that they're actually pedestrianising,
Hmm.
because I think Soho lends itself much better. If we're talking about Amsterdam and a lot of other European cities, Soho would have been pedestrianised decades ago if it was in Amsterdam or if it was in the Netherlands or even France or something like that, because it just those tight, narrow streets with those bars spilling out and those restaurants spilling out, it's just crying out for it. So definitely Soho.
Well, Soho is famously populated by people who seem to be surprised that they've found themselves living in Soho as well, and keep kind of objecting to this stuff all the time. So it'd be nice just to see them overruled, frankly.
It's maybe being a bit diplomatic there, but yeah, I agree. It's Soho. It's always been a nightlife area. I don't know who's expecting it to be quiet. It's never been that way.
I'll be less diplomatic. I think the residents of Soho, fuck them. That's another one to add to the list of people we've offended on our podcast. So something we've covered on our show quite a lot. We've been doing the show about 6 months now, and we often talk about strange regulations and how they change or have adverse consequences. So Martin spoke on a previous episode about how there's planning rules in London which force new build flats to have like dual aspect windows. The ostensible reason is to allow a breeze to pass through or to cool them without air conditioning or something like that. But are there any sorts of rules like this that you think have had like an outsized impact? Because I always think like when I'm playing GeoGuessr, I can immediately tell if I'm looking at Britain. Is there a reason why buildings in Britain look the way they do? I know that's a very vague question, but in terms of surely it's going to be like the dual aspect thing. That changes how you design a block of flats and how you can lay it out and stuff. There must be like loads of little things like that which affects how Britain looks, I guess.
Definitely. It's always been the case as well. A lot of people say like, oh, all modern architecture is boring, it all looks the same. I'm like, well, have you seen a Victorian terrace street? They look the same whether you're in Bristol or Manchester or Birmingham. I mean, they do all have little differences. On GeoGuessr, maybe this is a bit overconfident, but I'm pretty sure if you drop me on a terrace street in Birmingham versus one in Manchester, I'd be able to tell which is which. They do have slight intrinsic differences, but the format is the same. And I think it's the same now. Yeah, it's often regulation or viability that kind of defines how buildings look. I think a lot of people say like, oh, architects don't have any imagination anymore. Between the regulations and viability, architects actually have very little space to play with, which is why a lot of apartment buildings look the same. But I think in the trade-off between getting more homes and reducing homelessness and getting more people on the housing ladder and actually with a roof over their heads and things like that, versus having fewer homes that all look a bit different and are all a bit interesting. I mean, with the kind of the dual aspect thing and the fact that all new homes in London have to have balconies and things like that. I was at a conference about a year ago now, and there was a guy there who was saying London only ever lets us build BMWs, whereas sometimes we just want to build some, like, I don't know, Fiat 500, something a bit cheaper. And really, if London wants all of these really, really nicely designed and like balconies and dual aspect flats, he has to accept that there's going to be less of them. And the example that he gave was Manchester, where the planning regulations are a little bit more relaxed, which is an overhang from the 90s, the 80s and 90s, when nobody wanted to develop in Manchester. So they very much toned down the regulation a little bit to get more investment in. And as a result, I mean, it's not that Manchester's flats aren't as nice as London's, it's not that they're not as well built, but they do get more built because they don't have these balcony requirements, they don't have the dual aspect requirements. They let developers build Fiat 500s rather than all BMWs. And I think, again, if people were given a choice of like, would you rather have a flat with a balcony and dual aspects or just a flat? A lot of people would say, I just want a flat, to be honest. And I think there's a real market for, obviously, we want homes to be high quality and we obviously want them to be as nice as possible with a balcony and everything. But I don't know if that's answered your question at all. I think I've gone off on a random old tangent there, I'm afraid.
No, I like that. I completely agree with you. I mean, I live in a completely bland new build house, which is not at all interesting looking. But because I own a house, because I was lucky enough to be able to afford a mortgage on it, I can drill holes in the walls and paint the walls what I like.
Exactly.
So that's perfect. So
Exactly.
how can we tell what buildings are gonna age well? Like, you highlight all these amazing examples of historic architecture on your channel and modern stuff you think age well. In a few years' time, are we going to look back on stuff we're building today and think, oh, what were we thinking? Like, can we get around that?
It blows my mind when people say like, "Oh yeah, loads of modern buildings that look like really badly built." I do follow. There's that guy on TikTok, the new build guy, and he goes around like picking out bits where like there's a banister hanging off, or like things like that. And understand that obviously that's really poor. But the buildings, and especially apartment buildings that we build nowadays, are safer than ever before, especially post Grenfell. We've had those regulations have come in. Buildings built today are really solid, and there's no reason why they couldn't last hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Certainly, when you're comparing to a lot of the stuff that the Victorians built, which a lot of it was amazing, but some of it has already fallen apart, is falling apart, has loads of damp and mold and things like that. So the buildings we build today, I think will be around for hundreds of years. As to whether we'll regret them or not, yeah, I mean, it's all subjective. I meet lots of people who hate brutalism. I quite like brutalism. I can see why people look at the Barbican and say, "Oh, that's hideous." I get it, but I personally quite like it. But I don't want to be one of those people that comes on and says like, "Oh yeah, architecture is subjective. You're wrong for hating a building that is obviously ugly." Like there are obviously ugly buildings out there. I think we're learning. I think so. The 60s and the 70s, we made a lot of mistakes, and I think architects have learned a lot of those mistakes. Urban planning has learned a lot of those mistakes. We're not building walkways in the sky anymore that people just get mugged on. We're not building these shadowy corners without any natural surveillance that obviously, again, people just get mugged on. We're now building, and I think if you go to places like Elephant Park or Hackney Wick, we are now building stuff that really is the Victorians and people before that would actually recognize as a building. It has a ground floor, it has a middle bit, and then it has a sort of like a top tier, like a roof. And that sounds really basic, but they probably wouldn't recognize the estates that we built in the 60s as buildings. But now that we're building again a little bit more human scale and a little bit more to that same development framework that they did of buildings that nicely hit the street with a little retail unit, are made of brick and things like that. I think there'll be. I think if you look at the stuff in Hackney Wick, that's pretty typical of what is being built across London. I think
Hmm.
at worst it'll just be considered totally inoffensive in future. But won't even notice it. It'll just become part of London.
So you've talked, Sarah, a little bit about housing. Previously, you've talked a bit about cycling and sort of making better use of urban spaces. What are some of the other ways that we can make cities more livable, other than just getting rid of all the cars, for example?
I mean, I don't necessarily advocate for getting rid of all the cars. I think cars have a purpose in cities. I think we need to be providing people with a lot more choices as to how they get around. Cars are a massive part of our cities because urban planners have made them a massive part of our cities. We've built cities probably outside the kind of centres of London and Manchester and Birmingham. We've built cities and suburbs where people need to drive. They've built these retail parks in these suburbs where really not much stuff is walkable and people have to have a car and they have to get in their car. So I think part one is probably not, I don't want to go bulldozing suburbs because then again, that's just a terrible idea. But with things like retail parks, we can make them a bit denser by putting in some apartment buildings, making the public realm a little bit nicer, maybe pushing the car park underground if that's possible, and just making them a little bit more walkable. And we talked about quick wins earlier. I think in my Dutch video, I talked about it's not just cycle lanes there, it's the way that the walking infrastructure is designed makes it a nice, pleasant walk. In the UK, we have these like really wide junction mouths that people have to cross, and it's this big tarmac desert. Whereas in the Netherlands, you often end up with, they call it a continuous crossing. So that kind of goes across the road, and it means that pedestrians are given priority. Instead of the pedestrian crossing the road, the cars are crossing the pavement. And that's just a little design thing that the Netherlands does really well that makes that walk a little bit more pleasant. Because say you imagine your walk to the supermarket, if you don't walk to the supermarket, ask yourself why that is. And I think in a lot of cases it'll be, oh well, half the walk is across a retail park or down a really nasty road or across a big wide gaping road where the lights don't turn green. You get like a 30-second green phase every 5 minutes, and it's just a pain. I'll just jump in my car. And that's perfectly understandable when you see the kind of walks that a lot of these people have. And I think if we just make that and just reduce those barriers to walking and reduce those barriers to cycling, you'll soon start to see an impact, not only on people's lives, but also if people are walking more instead of driving, it'll have a big impact. I think there's a stat, and I hope this is right. I think this is right. 1/3 of car journeys in London are under a kilometre. Kilometre is like, for a young person, that is like a brisk walk. And imagine if we reduced traffic in London by a third just by putting in nicer crossings and, that sort of stuff. It sounds crazy, but I think it is possible.
It is interesting because, like, I mean, we're not as bad as America, for example, but compared to somewhere like Holland or Belgium, where I've worked, there you feel like if you're walking around in the street or you're crossing a road, you kind of belong there. And it's almost like the cars are the intruders. Whereas in parts of London, you sort of feel a little bit like you're doing something wrong or naughty by
Sorry
trying to
for being
cross
in your
this
way.
road. And
Yeah,
I'm terribly sorry to, interrupt your journeys. Yeah.
yeah, agreed. Sorry, can I just cross this road? I'm really sorry. Yeah, that's how it feels. Yeah.
So very finally, Ed, because we want to let you get back to making excellent videos. Speaking of cars, I guess the big change that we could probably expect to make an impact on cities in the next however many years is self-driving autonomous cars. They already have been invented. They're already on the streets of San Francisco and like Tucson and Los Angeles and things like that. Eventually, at some point in the future, they will be in Britain as well. What sort of impact do you think this will have? If this happens, we'll put some caveats on that because Martin's more of a skeptic than I am about self-driving cars. But if this is a future that we are looking at, what sort of impact do you think that will have on the way our cities are designed and lived in?
I think my main fear is, and I'm sure they have, but have they properly worked out the technology? Obviously, I think UK streets are a little bit more complex than your average US street. For a start, you're allowed to what they would call jaywalk. And I know that people in the US do still jaywalk, but does the car expect that to happen? And then if the answer to that is no, and they say, oh, we have to redesign the streets to accommodate these cars, then I'm not for it. But if we can make it work, I think it's very exciting. I think I'd feel bad for Uber drivers because they should be out of a job pretty quickly, I imagine, which sucks. But if we can work it out, I think it's huge because what it does is it means that if you have a car and you're like, oh, well, I only use it to go to the supermarket, I only use it like once or twice a week. I'm just going to use Uber or whatever the self-driving thing is. This little pod arrives outside your house. You get in, it takes you to where you need to go, and then you get in the pod back to your house. Suddenly, you don't need a car. And what I'm imagining is that all of these streets, all of these residential streets that are filled with people's cars parked outside, maybe we don't need that in the future. If people can just call up a Uber pod and it comes and collects them, and that can be their main form of transport. And then maybe if they want to go out into the countryside, they get a zip car. That would be fantastic because I think on average, a car spends 95% of its life parked up. So if you can reduce the number of cars that are being parked up and increase the amount of cars that are actually useful at taking people around from place to place, that can only be a good thing for space in our cities. And of course, with all of that space that we've freed up from people not parking their cars all over the place anymore, I would advocate putting up some more trees, putting in some more benches, nice wide pavements. Maybe cafes can spill out onto the pavement a little bit more, and that increases the amount of business that they can get. I think that's really exciting to think about.
Fantastic. We'll leave it there. I'm going to look forward to architects in 2070 making like an old parking space like a feature because we don't really use them anymore. It's like a nice historical nod or something like that. But no, Ed, it's been so fascinating talking to you. We'll put links to all your stuff on abundancepod.com so people can go and check it out. I do apologise to the listeners in advance. You are now going to spend several hours on YouTube just watching video after video because they're so good. But for now, City Ed, thank you very much.